Ah, the Old West. Rockstar spent about a year bringing Red Dead Redemption 2 to PC, and as expected, it's a massive game with some pretty heavy hardware requirements and absolutely tons of graphics settings to play with. As you'll see from our performance analysis, you might need to upgrade your PC to take full advantage of all the options Rockstar has given us here, so let's saddle up and jump right in. Like Grand Theft Auto 5, Red Dead 2 doesn't have any graphics presets. It will try and auto-detect settings that are good for your hardware, but you'll probably want to do some tweaking. A slider labelled Quality Preset Level seems like it would help, but ends up being a bit confusing with nebulous targets like Favor Performance and Balanced. In our testing, using the Vulkan Graphics API give us the highest frame rates, but try DirectX 12 to see which works best for you. Red Dead 2 has a ridiculous 40 graphics settings, so to test their impact we set the quality preset to minimum and then adjusted them one by one. Most have a minor impact on frame rate, but there are a few to watch out for. Reflection quality and volumetrics quality make the biggest difference, followed by global illumination, shadows and screen space ambient occlusion. Fiddle with those first to get better performance. We put 20 graphics cards through Red Dead 2's built-in benchmark, along with a range of CPUs and laptops, thanks as usual to MSI who helped provide us with the hardware for testing. Right now, no single GPU can hold a steady 60 FPS at 4K Ultra, and even 1440p Ultra is tough. But let's start from the low settings, where Red Dead 2 does at least stay at 60 for most of the time. At minimum quality, Red Dead looks okay, but texture quality is poor and the world in general looks very bland and blurry. There's a massive difference between low, medium and high texture quality. Performance here actually isn't great. The GTX 1060, both 3GB and 6GB variants, can average 60 FPS, and so can the RX 570, but anything slower is going to struggle. Unfortunately, minimum frames per second tend to fall below 60 FPS, even on powerful graphics cards. Jumping up to high settings, this is as far as we'd recommend for most PCs, saving Ultra for future hardware. At 1080p high, our average frame rates are considerably lower, but the good news is that minimum frames no longer represent a big gap. Performance is more consistent. Newer graphics card architectures clearly do better here, even on weaker cards. For a steady 60 FPS, we'd recommend an RX 5700 or RTX 2060 Super. Running Red Dead at 2560 by 1440 with high settings is illuminating because it's actually less demanding than 1080p Ultra. If you have a high-end card, native 1440p is within reach. Average FPS tends to be better on AMD's cards, but the minimum FPS dips are a bit worse. To play at 60 FPS, you'll want at least an RX 5700 or RTX 2060 Super, and only the 2080 and better manage to keep even minimum frames above 60. 4K Ultra is ridiculous, so in Red Dead 2 we opted for 4K high settings instead, which is actually quite playable if you have a $1,000 graphics card. This is really a throwback to GTA 5's PC release, where graphics king at the time, the 980 Ti, couldn't even run the game at 30 frames per second at max settings. If you're looking at Red Dead 2 and wondering how not even the 2080 Ti can handle 4K at maximum quality, this isn't really anything new. If you're willing to lock the frame rate to 30, an RX 5700 XT or RTX 2070 Super should give you some consistent performance, while the top-end cards can just squeeze out an average of 60 FPS. When we turn our attention to CPUs, Red Dead 2 stuttered and stumbled out of the saloon at launch, but has since sobered up. In the early going, any CPU with fewer than 8 threads experienced serious frame rate stalls that could render the game nearly unplayable on some PCs. With the latest updates, Red Dead still likes having some extra cores and threads available, and works best with Core i7 or better Intel chips, or a Ryzen 5 or better, but is certainly playable on lesser hardware. The 4-core i3-8100 does manage a playable 60 FPS, and at lower settings can almost, but not quite hit 100 FPS. Just about everything else will push well beyond that level. The Ryzen 5 3600 is just ahead of the i5 8400 and only slightly behind the Ryzen 9 3900X. So additional cores and threads don't seem to matter much on AMD beyond a certain point. For Intel, the i7-8700K is ahead of the 3900X, overclocking to 5 GHz improves performance by about 10 FPS, and the i9-9900KS is up to 20 FPS ahead of the 8700K. Of course, if you run with slower graphics cards or crank up the settings, the CPU becomes far less of a factor. And what about laptops? Despite their typical lower clock speeds than desktops, we actually saw good laptop performance on the GL63, which has a 4-core 8-thread processor. As expected, the laptop graphics cards can't quite keep up with the desktop variants, but even the 2070 Max-Q can hit an average of 70 FPS in our testing. Red Dead 2 didn't have a good PC launch, with issues causing stuttering and crashes on many PCs. It's a bit surprising to see big stability problems in a marquee PC game that looks as good as this one. With the patches in place, Red Dead 2 is far stabler and less likely to take a dive on performance. Ideally, you'll want at least a 6-core CPU and a mid-range graphics card for good 1080p high frame rates, but you can get by with less. There were launch problems that seemed to stem from this being a console port tailored to a specific set of hardware, but those issues have been ironed out. Red Dead Redemption 2 on PC is no doubt a definitive version of the game. If you want to really push the limits of today's hardware, it even supports multi-GPU via the Vulkan API. 4K and maxed out settings at 60 FPS? Yeah, you can get there with a pair of 2080 Ti cards, or maybe next year's hardware. Anything less than that is likely to fall off the horse.